Kia ora koutou everyone, and welcome to 257 and to this week's session from the Fabian Society. My name's Ollie Nees. I'm a barrister and journalist here in Wellington and occasional participant in the Fabian's organising committee. And I'm pleased to welcome our two speakers here today, Nicky Hager and Anjum Rahman. Today we are talking about intelligence, security and secrecy. What should our intelligence agencies look like after March 15? As well as triggering a whole range of profound debates about racism, Islamophobia, gun reform and social media regulation, the horrific events of March 15 raised some serious questions about the priorities and oversight of New Zealand's intelligence agencies. And it is now pretty clear that for years there was a skewed focus on the threat of radical Islamic extremism, with little attention paid to the rising and very real threat of right-wing extremism. And that was confirmed in the Royal Commission of Inquiry's report released in November 2020, which found that there was an inappropriate concentration of counter-terrorism resources on the threat of Islamist extremist terrorism. And at the same time, the SIS had limited understanding of right-wing extremism in New Zealand. Various reviews and work programs are now underway all across the public sector, from DPMC to the police to the security agencies themselves. And this year, there's now a review into the law governing the more intrusive powers of our security agencies. So, how are we doing? Where are we going? And are we even heading in the right direction? Already there are signs we're heading in one possible direction. Last year, the Inspector General of Security and Intelligence reported that the SIS, one of our intelligence agencies, is already collecting more data than ever before and conducting more discovery activities. But critics have raised the question of whether this is really a question of capacity and power, or rather one of prioritisation. So who should set the priorities of our intelligence agencies? What role should the public have in overseeing our most secret of institutions? And when it comes to security, intelligence and defence, what actually is our national interest? Those are some questions of my own and not necessarily ones that will be answered today. But with that in mind, I'd like to pass it over to our two speakers today. Nicky and Anjum have both, in their own ways, been dealing with the security agencies for some time, and both have become leading voices on these issues. First, we'll hear from Nicky, who's going to give us an overview of who we're actually talking about here. Who are these agencies? Where have they come from? And Nicky, as I'm sure many of you will know, has been writing about these issues since the mid-90s with the publication of his book, Secret Power, which was the first real look at the GCSB, one of our intelligence agencies. Then we'll be hearing from Anjum. Anjum's a Muslim community leader and human rights activist whose writing I'm sure many of you have read. She's a founding member of the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand and a founder of Inclusive Aotearoa, an organisation working to create a stronger sense of belonging through connections and collaboration. So with that in mind, I'll pass it over to Nicky, and at the end we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Kia ora tātou. As Ollie said, I'm going to give a very quick and basic introduction to the intelligence agencies, which, looking around the room, various of you know perfectly well already, but I think it's good if we start in the same place, and then during the question time, I'm hoping we can go into more depth. So New Zealand's got all sorts of things with intelligence on the title, but there are two main intelligence services. One is the SIS, the Security Intelligence Service, which has the job of spying most of the time within New Zealand to do with New Zealand security issues. The definition of security we could talk about later. The GCSB, Government Communications Security Bureau, notice what an unspy title that is, Communications Security Bureau, is the foreign intelligence agency which is dedicated through its life to spying on other countries' communications. So it's our main foreign intelligence agency. They're both utterly products of the Cold War. The SIS was formed in 1955, the GCSB in 1956, in the depths of the Cold War. Both were formed at the instigation and with the assistance of the British Secret Services, who were essentially setting up, for their own purposes, a South Pacific outpost of their own operations, which New Zealanders would staff and run thereafter. The SIS was dedicated to Cold War goals. You can imagine the kind of things, you've probably heard of the kind of things. It spied on the Chinese embassy, the Russian embassy, any other Eastern European embassies or delegations that came to New Zealand. They would be there tracking them in cars and watching them through windows. They really did. It was the times. But at the same time, half the units were dedicated to these foreign embassies, but the other half of the units within the SIS, the sections, were dedicated to spying on New Zealanders, and in particular, left-wing New Zealanders, communists, socialists, feminists, Maori activists, and so on, which meant that the SIS became an object of, a justified object of hate and fear for generations of left-wing New Zealanders. After the Cold War, the intelligence services didn't go away. They floundered for 10 years during the 90s, and then the War on Terror gave them a new life. The SIS started to mouth the platitude that the greatest threat to New Zealand was Islamic terrorism, which was as stupid then as it is today, and was never true about this country, but it became an object of loyalty to their allies that were saying the same thing. And they got resources for it, many resources. The SIS staff went from 100, quite small at the time of the September 11 attack in the United States, increased by 300% in the years since. More and more staff, many of them dedicated to the Auckland office of monitoring the mosques and Muslim people of that city. At the same time, the GCSB was spying on the Soviet Union and similar targets. They were using radio communications at first, radio interception at first, and their targets were, for New Zealand, utterly obscure and I would say irrelevant targets, such as Russian troop movements in Siberia. Might be what they're monitoring that night because the American base in Japan couldn't get the right frequencies, or there was a storm overhead, so they'd send it down to New Zealand to do the monitoring at that time. Very derivative on behalf of Allies work. And like the SIS, after the War on Terror began, the GCSB moved in that direction as well, and particularly in the development of what's called support for military operations, which meant that for the first time there were large numbers of GCSB staff being posted overseas, a continuing role today, which is not nearly discussed enough, of us joining in the targeting of overseas wars. The other thing to say about the GCSB is that although it was set up against the Soviet Union and China, by the 1980s it was diversifying. Its first analysis cell had been for Russia, but its second one was for the South Pacific Islands. That means spying on all our South Pacific neighbours, which it continues to do to today. Its third analysis cell was against Japan, which New Zealand had no enmity for, was actually a friendly trading partner. But we continued that role to the present. And when the Snowden documents came out in 2013, we saw this astonishing lineup of countries, which meant like Iran, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam, diplomatic communications, North Korea, diplomatic communications of South Pacific states, of course all our South Pacific neighbours, because that continues to be a duty, and so on, of course China as well. What it means is that we were spying mostly on countries that were not New Zealand's enemies, which posed no threat to us, most of which wouldn't dream of spying on New Zealand in return, and were made no sense to spy on as the main priorities of the New Zealand Intelligence Agency. Why were they doing this? You all know the answer. Because as in the formation of the agencies and as it's gone on, their priorities came from their allies, the Five Eyes Alliance, as it's called nowadays. And so New Zealand changed but the alliances hadn't changed. The Five Eyes means the United States as the leader of everything that happens, Britain, its nearest and dearest ally, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Essentially white-faced, predominantly white-faced, English-speaking, post-colonial, continuing colonial nations working as an Anglo kind of alliance in the world. And this has been the fundamental problem pretty much about everything in New Zealand ever since. When you find a problem like the one we're going to focus on tonight, which is the attack in Christchurch and the lack of preparation, it's all about Five Eyes. It's always whatever the problem, it's usually the answer. I want to say a few words about accountability and oversight of these agencies, which is pathetic. Both the SIS and the GCSB, if you read their annual reports, say that they are the most open and transparent they have ever been. If you hear them giving a speech, if you hear them talking, they're constantly talking about openness. And as someone who's been monitoring them for decades, it's just not true. What they see as transparency, get the annual report, for example, the latest annual reports, and they do things like giving anonymized case studies of some of their targets, which aren't the one we stuffed up when we got it wrong, all the things that you need for accountability. It's this very dangerous person who you watched and made sure they didn't hurt anyone. It's like it's PR rather than accountability. And what I always think of at this, when we're looking at something like this, is in the United States in the 1970s, when they had had a terrible run of the CIA out of control and they were spying on the wrong people and things. And there was a committee called the Church Committee set up to investigate their own intelligence agencies. And this was the conclusion of the Church Committee, which is very relevant to everything we want to talk about with to do with accountability. They said, the most important lesson to be derived from our experience is that effective oversight is impossible without regular access to the underlying working documents of the intelligence community. Top-level briefings do not adequately describe the realities. For that, documents are a necessary supplement and at times the only source. Please remember this, because if you're ever talking about accountability in intelligence agencies, it always comes down to this. Nice, friendly words in an SIS and GCSB annual report mean nothing, because they never write down the things that go wrong, they never write down their mistakes, and they never write down the things which would be embarrassing or which they believe would be unpopular with the public. And so where the democratic accountability is needed most, the information is least and actually non-existent. So in fact, they're not more open than they were before. Our oversight system, which includes an Inspector General who's quite good, but we never hear what they do, so it's about legality rather than democracy. Our oversight system for the intelligence agencies is a Committee of Parliament which was especially set up in 1996 under special legislation so it wouldn't have the powers of a select committee. Did you hear me on that? The new MMP Parliament was coming in, the select committees were having strong new powers, and so they passed a special law drafted by the intelligence agencies for themselves, which meant that they had a different kind of statutory committee which wouldn't have the powers. What does it mean? It means that a member of Parliament who sits on that committee has a little more information than we do writing under the Official Information Act. Basically, if there's something embarrassing, wrong and bad which the agencies don't want to hear, they won't hear about it. Which leaves us with our current system of accountability, the one which actually works in New Zealand, which is not normally named, but you could call it accountability by leaks, failures and disasters. In other words, the way that we make progress and the way that we stop them being out of control is by things that they don't authorise, leaks, and by things that they never wanted anyone to know, like the latest disaster and thing they do wrong. And so we creak along and stumble along, better than nothing, by accountability through scandal kind of and trouble. And it works better than nothing, but it is hardly a rational system for a country. For example, in our history of mistakes, the SIS didn't catch or stop the Trades Hall bomber. The SIS didn't stop or catch the Rainbow Warrior bombers. It imprisoned as its greatest terror suspect of the war on terror, Ahmed Zawi, who was actually a leading Algerian human rights campaigner. My point being, each of these would become a way of having accountability by mistake, error, and stupidity. They targeted and harassed a Fijian terrorism plotter who was really a democracy campaigner. I don't know if you saw that, it was in the Snowden documents. And of course, they've harassed many Muslim people who'd done nothing wrong. And most recently, the biggest failure in their entire history, in their whole history for 70 years, was the March 15th mosque attacks in Christchurch. So for all those decades, they had undermined human rights and democracy because of their solemn task of protecting New Zealanders, but when they were needed most, they failed. They were caught up in their allies' preoccupations. They were spying on Iran. We still spy on the Iranian embassy day and night in Wellington because it's one of the Americans' enemies of the month. And they were much more concerned with anything Muslim than the worldwide growth of the far right, which is all I'm going to say at the moment, because I'd like to hear Anjum, who's going to talk for longer, and then please can we talk about this in depth if you want to over the questions.
Tēnā koutou katoa, he uri tēnei no inia, ko kirikiri roa toku whatu manua, ko waikato te awa e mahia nei aku maharahara, kei kirikiri roa aho e noho ana inai nei, ko Anjum Rahman toku ingoa, ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohe nei, ka mihi hoki o ki ngā tohu o te rohe nei. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the victims of the Christchurch mosque attacks, the victims of the Lynn Mall attacks, and the victims of terrorism and violent extremism everywhere. So in terms of the Christchurch mosque attacks, we had an attacker that was able to come to this country undetected, find a place to rent, get a firearms license within a month, have no member of his family be contacted in the procurement of the firearms license, travel alone extensively in and out of the country, and even prior to coming to Aotearoa, New Zealand, travelled extensively to many different countries, and that didn't raise any alarms at customs, managed to shoot himself and have a firearms, or no, he didn't shoot himself, but he had a firearm injury, and that didn't raise any alarms either. Joined a rifle club, and that did not raise any alarms at any point. Purchased firearms, purchased thousands of rounds of ammunition, and drive to the mosque, send a drone over the mosque, assess the building. None of these activities put him on any radar. Was on Facebook groups of groups that are now banned. I think they were the Lost Boys, or they whoever they were. That group got banned, and then another group, and so he operated under Harry Barry Terry, and was posting all kinds of crap, and that didn't get him under the radar of any agencies. As opposed to, for example, someone who was Syrian in Christchurch, went to a gun shop, asked about and viewed a few guns, did not buy anything, did not leave his name or address, any contact details, and was visited by the police the next day. So that gives you a little bit of indication of how things were. In terms of the Royal Commission of Inquiry, and I never follow orders, so I'll be talking about various bits and pieces that will not be national security as well as counter-terrorism and national security. I'm certainly not an expert in this area at all. But the Royal Commission process, so the process that they had is that they did establish a Muslim community reference group who they met with once a month, generally, and they met, and aside from the reference group, they had held hearings, formal hearings. So in terms of my involvement, I was part of the Muslim Community Reference Group, and I was also part of the Islamic Women's Council team that put in a submission and had formal hearings. No one from the Muslim Community Reference Group and no one from the Islamic Women's Council was given any kind of security clearance. They told us, because they were supposed to report in December 2019, that there certainly wasn't enough time. In fact, they reported in late November 2020, but they kept pushing back the dates so that they never did give anyone security clearance, which meant that we were never allowed to sit on any of the hearings with any of the public servants. We were never allowed to see what was asked. We were never allowed to see what evidence was presented. We were never allowed to challenge any of that evidence or put forward any questions. We couldn't we couldn't say, well, actually, this is wrong, or they lied about that, or anything like that. The evidence has been sealed. If you're a leader or a minister, it's been sealed for 30 years. If you're anything below that, it's sealed forever. So we will never be able to challenge anything that was put to the Royal Commission by any government official below a minister or a director of a state agency. Regardless, they came up with 44 recommendations, and there's a lot of detail on that, and 18 of those recommendations focused on improving New Zealand's counter-terrorism effort. And so before I get to the gaps, I'll quickly run over, and this is not just the 18, but on all of the 44 recs, I'll quickly run through stuff that I know is being done. So they have appointed a minister who's responsible for delivering on the recommendations. Government have said that they will implement all the recommendations. They just haven't said when. So they've got the minister, that's Minister Little, who's responsible for delivering on the recommendations. They've set up the Kapuia Advisory Group, which is a group of community members who are responsible for oversight over those recommendations. MSD is leading the work on the social cohesion framework. They have used the Involve method of engaging communities on that. So they set up a working group. They also did go out and meet with a lot of community groups to develop the social cohesion framework. As far as I know, that framework is with cabinet or ministers or something, and we're still waiting to hear as to whether it's been approved and then what would be the next steps for implementation. In terms of firearms, the legislation, there's been quite a bit of legislation passed. They're moving the firearms to get registered. They're making that an online system, so they're partway through. They're training police staff. They've now decided to have overseas police checks for people that are applying to get a firearms license, and I'm laughing because, why did they not do that before? I don't know. And they now also have to interview family members. There is now recording of hate crimes within the police, and they're putting a lot of investment into ensuring that they do record and report on hate crimes, and they're going through a process of training frontline staff so that they will do that better. They're working on a program to de-radicalise people. So the work on that is started, and the police is leading that work, and the program is called He Aranga Ake. Of course, the question is, what is radicalisation? What is de-radicalisation? What does that look like? Fun times, I don't know. They are, in terms of developing an accessible reporting system, so if you basically, the Royal Commission, which I wasn't impressed about, did talk about the see something, say something kind of stuff that they have in the UK. And what my response to them on that when they were thinking about it in the reference group was, what happens with that stuff. It's people of colour that get reported, and if you haven't seen all the videos of black people in gyms and just going about their normal business that get the police called on them because they're in too nice a neighbourhood or in too nice a car or whatever, But regardless, what they've done is now the 105 website, so you can actually sit at home on your phone, get on the website, upload photographs or emails and things, and I've done it, and it is good, it's easy. The response is still variable, but we've certainly fed in when we've not had responses that are great, but that's because we have places to feed that in. So for members of the general public, if the responses aren't there, there aren't those channels. And the 105 number that you can call as well to report stuff. In terms of the strategic framework, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet have been working on developing the counter-terrorism framework. That should be going to the relevant minister and going through Cabinet stuff. I think they've this Friday is one of their deadlines for something on that. They did engage with communities, they engaged with civil society organisations, I think they did engage with local governments. There's a working group that was convened that was made up of academics, government and civil society members. I haven't seen the final draft of that framework, but I've seen, the final version, but in earlier drafts I still feel like one of the issues that I had with their previous frameworks and things is that they have always treated government as some kind of neutral body in all of this that is looking from outside into counter-terrorism rather than a driver of driver of radicalisation. And they don't recognise, and I hope that they will this time, that the way that government acts and the government policies that are in place can serve to radicalise people, especially when you even look at things like poverty, housing, income inequality, access to education, access to health, all of the basics that a good government should do. If you're not doing that properly and you're leaving certain populations and communities vulnerable and you're not dealing with discrimination well, then you're actually a driver of some of these things. And we also know that governments can be and have been racist in many, many ways. Not just racist, but discriminatory in other ways as well. They're going through the media regulation review. They have appointed directors for the Centre for He Whenua Taurikura, which is the Centre of Excellence. One of the recs was to have a research centre to research counter-terrorism stuff. So the directors appointed, they had the launch in early June. I don't know that they've got much further on that yet, but work is happening. They have had a conference last year, and they'll have one this year to allow people in the general community, as well as government, as well as academics, to get to know each other and to talk about these issues. They have started publishing the national security priorities. They started doing that after the attacks, so at least we can know what their priorities are. They've put in the Ministry of Ethnic Communities, and they have, in terms of workforce diversity, started some kind of graduate program so that and it's about 15 a year, which again just is fun times when you're trying to build diversity into the public service. But at least the program has started. But at the leadership levels, I don't know what's happening in terms of ensuring that it isn't all white, basically. The stuff that isn't being done. So this isn't national security, but the hate speech legislation is just stalled. It's not going anywhere. We don't know what the new Minister of Justice will do about that. I understand that people do feel wary about free speech issues. But if my speech to the He Whenua Taurikura conference last year is still online, you kind of have to wade through and get through about an hour 47 or something. You have to wade through to get to it. But in that speech, I talked about, whose free speech are you talking about? And if you protect the free speech of certain types of people, then you're removing the free speech of other types of people, which really includes marginalised communities. And that there are deliberate silencing tactics to remove the free speech of minority communities in online spaces. And if you only defend the people that attack them, then you are removing and free speech rights from others, and we've seen numerous instances of people removing themselves from online spaces because it is just too hostile. But counter that, we also know that minorities are hit hardest with legislation. So any regulation and legislation that you put in that might be protective is actively used against us. And I always ask people, who made the biggest complaint to the Human Rights Commission around racist speech? What was that against? Who was it against? And I don't know if it's still true, but at the time that I asked that, it was complaints by Pākehā against Hone Haruira for his white MF sort of email that was a private email to someone that got leaked. So, we know that very often complaint systems don't work for us, and they don't protect us. And regardless of that, the Human Rights Commission, because it's speech, they can do race and so on, but it generally just doesn't, a lot of speech doesn't come under them. The biggest gap in the security and intelligence space is the Royal Commission recommendation to create a single agency, so to bring together all the agencies, including GSC, SB and SIS and all the other bits of the national security system, and have one agency. And the reason that they recommended that was because of the fractured nature of the national security system, and that the fact that there were tensions between agencies, or that people were falling through the gaps between agencies, that there was a lack of coordination, and certainly they found that there wasn't enough resourcing. So lo and behold, mere weeks after the Christchurch mosque attacks, the Security Intelligence Service received a $50 million boost, which you can imagine how well that sat with our community. And they didn't announce at the same time a $50 million boost for community organisations and prevention activities that were led by communities. I don't think they ever have. I think, so the government hasn't done anything on this, I'm pretty sure. I'm absolutely sure they have not moved at all on this one. The Royal Commission did recommend some additional protections around this recommendation. Like, they didn't name it as protections, but one of the recommendations was for the security intelligence agencies to provide more information and better information to the Auditor General, and that the Auditor General should have a stronger role in terms of oversight. They asked that the Voluntary Security Intelligence Board be turned into a proper legislated paid board to have oversight. They recommended that there should be an advisory group made up of community that has input. So given that they don't have the single security intelligence agency, I don't know, and I haven't gone looking, I'm sorry, I haven't had time, so I don't know if they've got a proper advisory group. I don't know if they've got a proper paid board over all of this stuff. Can't see why they would if they don't have the single agency. Other things that they haven't done that is beyond security is the mandatory reporting of firearms injuries, which was one of the recommendations. That's still under discussion, and I can understand why there's hesitation from the medical community because of the protected nature of the relationship between a doctor and patient, or any health professional and their patient. Of course, that confidential nature is breached in cases of illegality and family violence, and so there's the question of whether a firearms injury would breach that kind of threshold. They still haven't made any moves to recognise hate crime in the Crimes Act, and I find that appalling. I think that's a simple change that could easily be made. It's really not that controversial. Why is it needed? Because when someone commits a hate crime, they're not just creating fear in an individual. Their motivation is to create fear and to silence a whole community. So when the Rainbow Youth Centre was burnt in Tauranga last week, it was meant to send a signal to the whole community. It was meant to create fear. And so that's an additional level or aspect to the crime. And they're just not doing it. I don't know why. In terms of the ongoing recovery needs of victims, which was a set of recommendations, I don't think that's been resolved. So there are issues around, so we can't sue anyone. We can't sue the government. Well, the grounds for suing the government are very, very limited and will cost a lot of money with no certainty of success. But because of our ACC laws, we can't sue them for negligence. So if you're a victim who was here on a temporary visa or a visitor's visa and you got killed, your family overseas will not get any ACC. And there are victims, like there were parents of people or a particular victim that was killed who were reliant on the income that he sent from here and in a country with no social welfare whatsoever, and basically saying we were on the brink of starvation. They will not see any money. There are people that have lost businesses. ACC, when they give compensation, it's based on the income that you have at the time. One of the victims was in the early stages of establishing his business and was in IT, and once that business got very well established, his earning potential would have been immense. His 2-year-old daughter will never, she's deprived of that income that her father would have earned during his lifetime, and the compensation is nowhere near, not even close. As well as, they're now going through the coronial inquiry process, constant re-traumatisation. After the Buffalo attacks, they were sent live stream videos of that attack. They're constantly having to deal with issues. I think I've talked for a long time, but I did want to also cover off the counterterrorism legislation, because there was a recommendation to review it all in full. That hasn't been done. Doesn't look like they will do it. There's no sign of it. What they did do is pass the counterterrorism legislation bill last year. One of the things with our counterterrorism legislation is that it's almost always done under urgency. At one point, I think it was the 2014 changes to the legislation, they were hearing oral submissions in the 3 days they gave us to make submissions. That's how bad it was in terms of our ability to submit. And the bill last year had no human rights check, even though so many submitters asked for that. It did not designate any groups other than Muslim organisations. And so that is in terms of the designated terrorist list. There are no white nationalist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist groups listed at all, even though even Canada and Australia and the US and the UK have a couple. Not a lot, but a couple. We put in a recommendation to that legislation. In the in the UK and Australia, they have an independent legislative review body. Ignored. They did not put that through. So this would be a body that checks on the legislation, sees how effective it is. We're like, show us the evidence that these changes is making us safer. There's no evidence of that. They just keep passing more and more draconian legislation, but there's no checks, no independent checks whatsoever on that. And so, I personally put a lot of time. I'm a co-chair of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network. I called on the network. Swansea University Sidetrack submitted. I know I worked with the Human Rights Commission. They submitted. I sat through a lot of the hearings, and people were grossly opposed to that bill, and it just went in the middle of it. The Lynn Mall attacks happened, and they just put it through without any, no media commentary, no complaint, no nothing. And that's kind of where we are at with this stuff. So, yeah, I'm sorry to be so depressing, but that is what it is.
Thank you, Anjum, and thank you, Nicky, for those comments. We can now open the floor to questions. If anybody has a question while you're thinking of questions, I can get us started off. Anjum, you were describing from the Royal Commission of Inquiry some proposed oversight to a unified security agency. Aside from, and I think you were talking about some community involvement in that, aside from the question of implementation, what do you make of the proposals themselves? Is that a promising way forward, or is it still not enough?
Well, it's very much dependent on the mechanisms that they have surrounding it in terms of oversight, because if they don't have that, and if they don't have a community advisory group that is diverse, if they don't have leadership within that agency that is diverse, and they don't have diversity through the agency, then it really doesn't matter what structure you have. A racist structure is still going to be a racist structure. What are they doing to deal with the racism and the discrimination and the bigotry? And then you have the director of SIS saying to us, oh, well, we can't get Muslim people to come work for us. And it's like, yeah, surprise, surprise. Why would they? Like, what trust have you created in the community? Like, these are the people that would have passports withheld for our youth without giving them reasons why, that would almost coerce really young people to come and have coffee with them. And these people in our community didn't know that you could say no to this. And they were like, don't tell your parents or whatever. Like, these are not people that did any work to develop the trust that would make anyone who has any kind of competence want to go and work in their organisation. So they're on the back foot to start with. But it's that. It's also like just not understanding when we say this is a threat. So right at the moment, one of our biggest concerns is the Hindutva nationalism, and things in India are going really, really badly. And we have reported, we've reported stuff to say, look, this is an issue here that could erupt at any time, and we're concerned just as much for our safety as we are with other threats. If they're taking that seriously, I don't know. And if they understand the threat and what it means and so on, I don't know. So it's like, where is the cultural competency? How do we know? We don't know. People ask if we feel safe now. I don't know that I feel any safer than I did before 15th March. But yeah, so it is, until you deal with some of those underlying issues and the social cohesion stuff, for me, let's see you start implementing Mātiki Mai and then do a security agency, and let's see what it looks like.
Got a question down the front here.
Kia ora. This may be slightly outside the scope, but, we're used to that. When I heard Nicky's description of the lack of independence of the intelligence agency and Anjum's description of the culture that marginalises and leads to radicalisation of people, it reminded me of our police, which similarly the New Zealand Policing Act is administered by the New Zealand Police. There's no real independence, and we've recently had stories about their night checks for people on bail who, I think it was 63 visits in 36 days, including nighttime visits, resulting in a person snapping and attacking police and being shot and killed, as an example of where the person's pressure that was put on them has led to outcomes that are not desirable. And I just wondered, when an ordinary person thinks about who is doing surveillance, it's not just the intelligence systems, it's potentially the police working in association with those ones. So if you were looking at how legislative and operational reforms could happen, what would be the top recommendations you would make for police as well as for intelligence services? Sorry it's so long, but...
That was a very long and complex subject. I think, you know, there is a big police intelligence unit. They do surveillance. However, I think we would make a mistake to see the intelligence services and the police as being equivalent. And what this is about, ouch. What this is about is
Oh, okay. Yep, Andre's going to adjust it.
What I would suggest is, coming from a slightly different angle, is the way we should view, or we can view organisations, is to see how connected or disconnected they are with the society that they live in, and where the influence is coming from. And essentially, the more secret and the more divorced or cut off an agency is from its own people, its own country, its own, you know, people knowing what they're doing, people debating what they're doing, people having the basic information, have an opinion about what they're doing, the more cut off they are, the bigger the problem is, the less susceptible they are to input and change according to the culture of their own country. And so I think that, yes, you have the same problems in the police, but the police are more connected to the country than the intelligence agencies are. I'm not saying they're perfect. I know there's lots of problems with the police, but actually they are more connected. And compared to them, the intelligence agencies, because they run essentially a don't tell anyone anything unless it makes us look good approach to openness, means that they are not connected in with the society and they don't have to be responsive to it. That there's a direct correlation between how accountable you are and how you will act, basically. And so in the police, for example, there's been a many-year now campaign within it by motivated, decent people to try to change the culture. And they've got a long way to go because there was a huge culture problem. But there is. They've looked at the ethnic mix of people. They've looked at the genders. They've looked at their attitudes. There's still a problem with young brown people being hassled every Friday night. There's all these problems we know about, but they are more connected to society. The intelligence services are a special case. They really are, and they need to be recognised as such because they are so disconnected and unaccountable that they don't change, and they don't get their influence from their friends, from society, from the debate in New Zealand, half as much as they do from the little secret working groups that they fly away to attend with their foreign equivalents from the foreign intelligence agencies, coming back with their worldview. So I'm not disagreeing with you on the police, but I actually think that the agencies are in a class of their own in comparison.
Go ahead. I'll just very quickly respond to you in terms of, I don't know that regulation is always the answer, but transparency and oversight is definitely the answer. But to give you another example of the Linmore attacker, that investigation, it was supposed to have come out in June or early July. They're now saying August, but there was some serious issues going on there. And that guy, what can I say? So when he came, he spent 4 years on remand, and some of those years on remand were in the same unit as Brenton Tarrant. And he, in 2018, when he went before the judge, there was a rehabilitation plan provided to the court, and the judge was like, yep, this is a good plan, you should do it, and corrections just didn't. They wouldn't do it. And all the government effort was focused on pushing him out of the country and deporting him, rather than saying, well, he's still here, let's get a rehabilitation and get him out into the community. When he finally did have to come out, they put 30 police officers on him, watching him day and night, put him in a small mosque rather than one of the major mosques, with I don't know what community support. And he snapped and did this awful thing. And I don't, it's when corrections just refuses and just won't do it, and the police put 30 officers and whatever, but they don't have a proper community plan in place. Well, let's see what the investigation finds in terms of the community plan that they had. Look, regulation isn't going to fix that. I don't see how you can put in laws in place that will make them do what the judge said they should do. I don't know.
I think we have a question down the back.
Thanks for the talk so far, Anjum and Nicky. I'm fairly new to this whole subject, so it's been really interesting just hearing those initial insights. I guess this is probably mostly directed at yourself, Nicky. I guess I'm trying to think of what the SIS or the GCSB's response would be to why they are closed. And is it because they would argue that they have to be closed, otherwise the secrets, other countries will find out the secretive stuff that they shouldn't be finding out, and thus reducing the effectiveness of those agencies. I was just wondering if you had any kind of thoughts on that. Did that make sense? Or?
Yeah, so you're talking about the old conundrum of intelligence oversight and transparency, which is that they say, if we say that we're spying on someone, it won't work. But it's just not good enough. And I'll explain why. Because if you go down that route, then you can never say anything about anything. And the better way to approach this is to say, does China think we're spying on them? Yes, there's no secret there. There's no secret to keep. It's fine. And do the South Pacific Islands know they're spying on them? Yes, because Snowden showed it. I wrote about it years ago. We all know that. And so rather than claiming that there's a deep, dark secret, we find a different balance because we're going to have better policies and we're going to do a better job of it if we actually have it as part of the democratic process. Is this starting to make sense? Okay, I won't go on.
And T down the back.
Kia ora. Thank you both so much. I'm thinking about how the state uses these moments of terror, of exception, to justify reactionary, repressive, punitive measures, such as changes to the Terrorism Act, even the construction of a new unit up at Paremaremo prison for Brendan Tarrant, which I'm in contact with the partner of one of the men who were in the cell next to him, and that man was on remand, and that unit was designed specifically to hold him in indefinite solitary confinement, an extreme form of punishment that otherwise doesn't exist in our prison system. And what I worry about is how these new systems of punishment, of reactionary changes are put in place during these moments of exception, and our capacity collectively to resist this when it feels like, yes, things change under urgency. No matter how many submissions we do to select committee, how many times we do anything, our ability to push back against reaction and punitive laws. And I was wondering what insight you could have in terms of what we can do to resist this.
I don't know, infiltrate the public service. I don't know. We need to do politics differently. To me, there's some need for some fundamental change, and I've really lost faith in government as a way to create positive change for people. And that's why what I do now is working as a project that works in communities, because I think the answer has to be in communities. And that's, to me, that's where we focus our efforts, because it doesn't seem to matter who's in power sometimes. Like, for some things it does matter, But for a lot of things, and certainly in this area, it doesn't matter. And some of it is because of all of these agreements that we have, international agreements and international things that we have to do to keep our allies happy and all of those things. To me, it's the power of the collective, and how do you create allies, and how do you create the numbers so that they simply cannot ignore us. But even then, with that counter-terrorism bill, there was a lot of, people made submissions, there was a lot of noise, and then, the attack, and there was just no bandwidth. There was no space, there was nowhere to say, hey, just stop. And they did rush it through, but then they said to us, well, actually, it was only a 2-week difference, would have gone through anyway, and blah, blah, blah. But, I don't know. When they're just not listening to you, then it is community action and creating that groundswell, I guess, is the only way.
I just want to say, I agree. The only thing that ever changes these things in a big way is community action. But we don't want to lose heart about it. If we lose heart about this, being able to affect government, then we know what's going to happen. It will be stitched up with a few public servants in Wellington, security public servants. But our experience actually is that when people get organised, they have a good effect. We must never lose sight of that.
Oh, I'm still there. I know you are. Yeah, I'm still. I've been part of the working group for the counter-terrorism framework, and I've been talking to MSD about social cohesion and so on. So it's not that we don't stop talking to them and stop pushing, but ultimately the block isn't often the public servants, it's the politicians. But it's also the design of the system so that public servants get ultimately punished if they fail, or the smallest mistake is on the front page news and someone loses their job, and it just creates this really hostile, risk-averse environment as well, which is why it's for those kinds of changes, it really has to come from community pushing for systems change.
Down the front.
Just a quick question, Nicky. Do you know of any administration where you find the accountability acceptable?
Are you talking about intelligence agencies? No. No, I don't. The range of options that you have are countries where it's just a black hole and there's nothing at all, which is many of the countries in the world with intelligence agencies, through to the half-baked kind that we have. And which means that people have to think very hard before they create institutions in a democracy which they can't control. You have to think really hard about it. You can't be complacent or sort of trusting about it. You have to think, are we sure enough that we want to have this, that we will have something which we create, which is a monster which we can't then control? It's a really serious problem.
Down the front.
You've spoken about how right-wing extremism was a factor in March 15. Do you think those same right-wing ideas are a cause of the protests at Parliament and other sort of right-wing groups that have popped up recently?
They were there. So they absolutely have used the protest to recruit. And it is not just the people that were there, that they used that to recruit more widely. So if you follow people like Byron Clark and Te Rangi Kimara and various other activists that are exposing what's happening, and they were doing that all through the protests on Telegram, on Zello, with Counterspin Media, and other spaces. I don't think everyone that was at the protest were by any means there, but they were definitely present, and they were definitely having an impact, and they definitely used those protests to grow their movement.
It is a well-known and effective tactic of groups like those far-right groups which don't have much support and do not have a natural body of people who believe in them, to attach themselves to every successful and noisy thing they can possibly find, because they'll get some recruits and they'll get some prominence which they otherwise would never get with their crazy ideas. And so it's a warning to us. That's the way they work, and they'll keep working like that. And this is their time. Look around the world, and there isn't much of a natural home for them here, but there's partly a natural home for them here with a lot of overseas inspiration.
There's an online question asking if Nicky could expand on the findings of the Church Committee in the US.
It's probably not. So the Church Committee was set up after Watergate, after it was found that the CIA was running illegal phone tapping operations, after the Pentagon Papers, so it was after a whole lot of scandals, one after another, through the early 70s in the United States, where it's essentially that thing I said, agencies which had been running themselves, there was a critical mass of trouble, scandal and revelation and leaks that you had accountability for a change. And it shocked enough politicians that they set up this special select committee in Washington, which called in, basically there was such a stinking mess that the only way to deal with it was to bring it out in the open for a change. And so they hauled up, they demanded, they subpoenaed all the key intelligence bosses and all their witnesses, and came out with this incredibly damning report. But I do want to repeat the bit of it, of the whole thing, which I thought was most important, which we should remember, as I've already said it once, but I want to say it again, and quote, is they said for the future, because we don't always have a huge, massive Watergate and scandals like that, for the future, the lesson of this is that politicians, people in charge, the public, can't believe and can't be contented with the generalized, reassuring comments that they get from officials, security and intelligence officials. They're meaningless. And this is the same with my kind of work. Until you get in and you find out what the sections are called and what their operations plans are and what's that operation, which they kind of all wince when they talk about it, but no one wants to discuss it anymore. Until you get down to the level of the actual detail, oversight, discussion, transparency means not a thing. It's just spin. And so that was the main lesson, that was the main enduring lesson of the Church Committee, was that you couldn't leave agencies to do their own spin anymore. And of course, in many cases they have continued to, but the lesson remains for us.
Time for one or two more. There, and then we'll go to the back after that.
Thank you. I wondered if you knew if the monitoring of the far right had improved recently, and if it has there been anything done with what they've found?
So Rebecca Kittredge spoke at the He Whenua Taurikura conference last year, but subsequently in presenting to the Select Committee this year, they're kind of saying, so now they're now talking about the terrorism differently, so it's identity motivated, faith motivated, and something politically motivated extremism. And so effectively she's saying about 50% of the work they're doing is now based on white identity and those other types of extremism. So they're definitely, and since May 2018 they had started, but that was only about 8 months before the attack, and I don't think they went anywhere near far along the way of looking into that space, but they definitely say they are. You can also, there's the Combined Threats Assessment Group, and so they had put out a threat assessment on the Hindutva extremist, and I think they've changed it now, but the one that I saw, they decided to not describe them as faith motivated, which was really odd, because when you look at some of the videos from people in India, they're very much basing what they're doing strongly around faith. So they're certainly getting to be more aware. and they are working with other groups, and I expect that with the parliamentary protests and some of the, the stuff that's happening with the Nuremberg trials list and all those kinds of things, I would expect they were keeping an eye on that to some extent. I wouldn't know, like the secrecy is there in terms of what they're doing with what they're finding. I don't know. No idea.
Can I be less charitable? The SIS had its, as I said, had its greatest failure in its entire history, totally unforgivably. It wasn't like that people didn't know that the far right was rising. It wasn't like we hadn't seen that ghastly attack in Norway 8 years before that. They should have been completely on top of this. They were blinded by their own alliance mentality. And so...
I wouldn't even say they were blinded. They just wouldn't look. Their partners wouldn't look.
Yeah.
They refused to look, and so they didn't look.
They were sleeping along on it. And so obviously what I was going to say. Okay.
Yeah. No, I would challenge that. I wouldn't say it was ignorance or whatever. They knew. They just chose not to. Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Down the back there.
Yeah, I'd like you to comment on my comments. That's my question. Just the hate speech thing, I just think it's not as simple as people say, and I think there's been quite a struggle between what I call the right, whether it's ACT or whatever, in terms of freedom of speech and defining hate speech. And the other problem that's sort of gone with that, when Chris Farfoy was Minister of Justice, he was basically made mincemeat by the media when asked questions about that in terms of trying to define it. And it just seems to me that Labor then dropped it as too much as a hot potato. And I'm just wondering now that we have a new Minister of Justice whether they'll actually take that the whole question of hate speech seriously, or whether it's just too much as, because Labor's quite a centrist government where it's too much of a hot potato and don't, just kowtow to the right about freedom of speech, like ACT and all those others go on about. So it seems to me it's a political struggle. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it very much is, and it's about who has the biggest noise in the media when these issues come up. And up to very recently, they've had their go-to people they talk to: Stephen Franks, Bryce Edwards, Chris Trotter, Graham Edgler, and I'm not saying that these are terrible people, but we're all the people that are directly impacted and that have suffered the harm in that debate, and the people that have been receiving the extreme death threats and having threats that their children are going to be skinned and the skins hung out at the tree outside their door, showing that the person knows what their property looks like. I know that's illegal, but even then, getting action, trying to get the police to take action on some of that stuff, we don't have protection under the law. So it's a part of who gets heard in this, and what gets protected, because those defenders, when they took that case against Auckland Council when Southern Molyneux were here and didn't get the council venue, and they've taken the case against Massey University when Don Brash wasn't allowed to speak, but you never see them taking cases when it's a person of colour or another marginalised group. So then it comes back to that question of whose free speech you're protecting, and then they'll be like, oh, but this will benefit you as well. Well, it's like you never use a person of colour. You're not raising tens of thousands of dollars when it's our free speech that's impacted, and you're not protecting our free speech rights at all. I mean, the Kashmiri community had Parliament booked to have an event to talk about what their issues. And the then foreign minister or whatever suddenly decided a few days before the event they couldn't use the venue and banned it pretty much. That was their free speech gone. You never see people like this standing up for issues like that. They don't. And so if they don't, then they're really not talking about free speech. And they're not really protecting free speech. They're protecting white supremacy effectively. is what they're doing.
We've got one
question.
more online. Someone says, should intelligence be limited to secret information? Could they be providing other information to assist us understanding the critical issues that we need to deal with?
What a marvellously rational question. Because the idea of intelligence is that you find out information that you need as a country to know. And most intelligence agency people who are open now would say that nearly everything they need to know is not secret. And that, especially in the internet age, their main problem is not a lack of information, it's the same as everyone else's, it's just too much information. And that the contribution of secret intelligence is marginal most of the time. And so what I would say is that's the rational way of seeing it, and that would radically change things. The problem is that that's not a rational process because it is our intelligence and gathering and assessment is not primarily driven by New Zealand. And this is our great long-term problem, which has come from those 1950s organisations, which is that most of their priorities and most of their targeting and most of their analysis is done on behalf of the foreign allies. This is our problem. Our problem is that we don't have an intelligence service here. We have an intelligence gathering for our allies service here. And so that rational question of surely we could get our intelligence that we need to inform us on petrol prices or instability in the South Pacific, or so, couldn't we find other ways to do that? Yes, we can, and we do, and we could. But that's not what they're doing. And so it's topsy-turvy because what sounds like a good solution is not relevant to what's really going on, and it doesn't fit with the worldview of the people who are sustaining what goes on, because they're seeing our security essentially in how can we do the maximum we can for the allies so that we can build up brownie points with them. That's their worldview. But it's not the worldview of that rational questioner there.
So I would say you have a look at recommendation 9 of the Royal Commission's recommendation, because they're saying, so, and I don't know that I understand it fully, but they're probably in the full report describe what they mean by this, but they say they want to see driving a change in the approach to the need-to-know principle across relevant public sector agencies, with special attention given to local government, including the emergency management structures at the local and regional level, to ensure it enables rather than just restricts information sharing. And then overseeing the implementation within 6 months, and I don't even know if this has been done, of recommendations in the 2018 review of the New Zealand security classification systems, and then they have a 1, 2, 3 and 4 recommendations around that. So even the Royal Commission is saying that they should loosen up a little bit. And I don't even know if they've done that. I don't know. I have no idea if they've done that.
All right, I think time's getting on, so one more at the back.
We have run out of time, so we'll have to leave it. Yeah.
Oh no, one at the back.
Sorry, I'll be quick. I was just wondering about developments in 2020, talking about CCTV with facial recognition technology owned by a Chinese data company that's now apparently been pressed pause on, and whether there are any plans to unpress pause, and what protections we have against them pressing unpause on that.
I mean, all I know is that the police apologised because they were unfairly targeting Maori youth on that. And the police commissioner did make some noise about going through consultation and stuff, but yeah, I'm not up to date on it.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for coming, and on behalf of everyone, I'd just like to thank our speakers today, Anjum and Nicky. That was a really informative talk. So before we go, I think we'll just all wish them a thanks for speaking today.